All right, folks, welcome back to Great American Classics. This is your host, and today we're going to talk about a story that, honestly, I've been wanting to share for a while now. It's one of those accounts that really sticks with you, you know? The kind of story that makes you sit back and think about what it really means to serve, and to sacrifice, and to somehow keep going when everything around you says you probably shouldn't be able to. Today we're talking about Lieutenant Khe McClary, a Marine recon officer in Vietnam, and the night that changed his life forever on a hill that most people have never heard of. This is about courage under fire, about brotherhood that runs deeper than anything else, and about a young man from Charleston, South Carolina, who gave everything so that others could live. So, let's get into it. Now, to really understand Khe McClary's story, you've got to start at the beginning, and I mean way before Vietnam. Patrick Cleburne McClary III was born and raised in the South Carolina Low Country, near Georgetown. And when I say Low Country, I'm talking about that beautiful, marshy, sprawling landscape that defines coastal South Carolina. It's the kind of place where the rivers wind through salt marshes, and the Spanish moss hangs heavy from the live oaks, and the humidity wraps around you like a blanket in the summertime. His family lived on Friendfield Plantation, this enormous piece of land, about 10,000 acres, which is hard to even picture when you think about it. 10,000 acres. That's more than 15 square miles of land. Now, the McClarys had actually owned the plantation for a few years before the Great Depression hit. But when hard times came, like they did for so many families back then, they had to sell it. The Depression was brutal on everybody, but especially on people who owned land and couldn't make it productive anymore. But here's the thing. Klebe's father didn't just walk away. He stayed on as the superintendent of the property. And so young Klebe grew up right there on that same land his family had once owned. There's something poignant about that, I think. Growing up on a place that used to be yours, but isn't anymore. But still treating it with the same love and care as if it were. And honestly, it sounds like it was about as idyllic a southern boyhood as you could imagine. Klebe spent his days hunting, fishing, riding horses, and playing just about every sport you could think of. If you've ever been to the South Carolina Low Country, you know that it's a sportsman's paradise. The rivers and creeks are full of fish. The marshes are teeming with waterfowl. The woods are home to deer and turkey and all kinds of game. A boy who grew up there in that era, with 10,000 acres to roam around on, would have learned to track and hunt and read the land in ways that most kids today just don't get the chance to. Those skills, as it turned out, would serve Klebe well in Vietnam, where tracking and moving silently through difficult terrain was literally a matter of life and death. His father taught him a strong work ethic, taught him about responsibility and character, and those were lessons that would serve him well later on when everything got a whole lot harder. The McClary family was religious. They went to church. They were moral people. But by Klebe's own account later in life, they didn't really know yet what it meant to be born again in the Christian sense. That spiritual dimension would come later, much later, after all the things that happened in Vietnam. Sometimes it takes being broken down completely before we can be built back up with a stronger foundation. And that was certainly the case for Klebe. Growing up the way he did, it's probably no surprise that Klebe was drawn to athletics. He was good at sports, really good. And when it came time to think about what came next after high school, well, he wanted to join the Marines right away. That's what his heart was telling him. There was a war going on, or at least the early stages of what would become a war, and the Marine Corps represented something to him. Duty, honor, service, the chance to be part of something bigger than yourself. But you know how it goes sometimes. People in your life, people who care about you, they have other ideas. In Klebe's case, he was persuaded to go to college first, to Clemson, the big state school in South Carolina. Clemson is a football powerhouse now, and it was a big deal back then, too. And for a young athlete from the Low Country, it was a natural fit. And he did. He went to Clemson, and he played football, and by all accounts, he was pretty good at that, too. Football teaches you a lot of things that translate to other areas of life. It teaches you discipline, teamwork, how to push through pain and exhaustion, how to execute under pressure. Those are skills that a Marine officer would need, even if Klebe didn't know at the time that's where his path would lead. After college, he realized his dream of becoming a coach, and he started working as a football coach. There's a particular satisfaction that comes from taking young people and helping them develop, not just as athletes, but as human beings. A good coach is a teacher, a mentor, sometimes almost a parent figure. Klebe found meaning in that work, in shaping the next generation and passing on what he'd learned. Life was looking pretty good for this young man from the Low Country. He had a career he loved. He was engaged to a beautiful Southern girl named Deanna. Everything seemed to be falling into place exactly the way you'd hope it would. The future looked bright. A coaching career, marriage, maybe kids, the American dream unfolding just the way it was supposed to. But then, something happened that changed the whole trajectory of his life. The kind of moment that divides your life into before and after. It was March of 1967, just a few weeks before his wedding was supposed to take place. Klebe was on a college campus, and he witnessed something that he just couldn't shake. A group of students protesting the Vietnam War decided to burn an American flag right there on the football field. Now, you have to understand, this was 1967. The country was deeply divided over Vietnam, and these kinds of protests were happening more and more. The anti-war movement was growing, and for many young people, especially on college campuses, opposing the war had become a kind of moral imperative. They saw the footage coming back from Vietnam, the body bags, the villages being destroyed, and they believed that America had no business being there. On the other side were people who believed that stopping the spread of communism in Southeast Asia was essential, that the men who were fighting and dying there were heroes, and that opposing the war was tantamount to spitting on their sacrifice. These two worldviews were increasingly coming into conflict, and that conflict would define American society for years to come. But for Klebe McClary, watching that flag burn while American boys were fighting and dying overseas, it was more than he could take. That flag meant something to him. It represented his country, his heritage, the sacrifices of previous generations going back to the Revolution. It represented the men who were over there right now, in the jungles and rice paddies, putting their lives on the line because their country had asked them to. And here were these students, safe on a college campus, burning that symbol as if it were nothing. He later said that he told his coach right then and there, "I'm out of here. I can't be watching this when my country is at war." And that was it. No hesitation, no second guessing. He resigned from his coaching position that very day and went straight to the Marine Corps recruiter. His country needed men, and he was going to be one of them. It was the kind of decisive moment that reveals character the kind of choice that some people agonize over for weeks or months. But Khe made it on the spot. He knew who he was, and he knew what he had to do. Now, basic training is tough for everybody. That's kind of the point. The Marine Corps has a well-deserved reputation for having the most demanding basic training of any branch of the military. They break you down and build you back up. They push you to limits you didn't know you had. They teach you that you can do things you thought were impossible. And they weed out the people who can't hack it. Because in combat, weakness can get not just you, but everyone around you killed. During basic, Khe was identified as having leadership potential, and he was selected for Officer Candidate School, which they call OCS, down at Quantico, Virginia. OCS is where the Marine Corps trains its officers, and it's even more demanding than basic training. The men and women who go through OCS are being prepared to lead Marines in combat, to make split-second decisions that will determine whether their people live or die. The pressure is intense, and the washout rate is significant. By his own admission, Khe wasn't the best at everything they threw at him. He struggled with the drilling. You know, the marching and the formations and all that precise military movement. If you've ever seen a Marine Corps drill team, you know how exacting the standards are. Every movement has to be perfectly synchronized, every angle exactly right, every sound crisp and sharp. It takes hours and hours of practice to get it right, and some people have a natural aptitude for it, while others have to work harder. Khe was in the second category, and the academics gave him trouble too. OCS involves a lot of classroom instruction on tactics, leadership theory, military history, weapons systems, and a dozen other subjects. You have to be able to absorb a huge amount of information in a short time, and then apply it under pressure. Khe wasn't a natural scholar. But here's the thing about Khe McClary. He didn't quit. He pushed through. When something was hard, he worked harder. When he fell behind, he found a way to catch up. He made it through OCS and came out the other side as a newly minted Marine lieutenant. Second Lieutenant McClary. He said goodbye to his new bride because he'd gotten married to Deanna just before shipping out, and then he was on his way to Vietnam. Deanna would spend the next several months not knowing from one day to the next whether her husband was alive or dead. And then she would spend years helping him put his life back together after he was nearly killed. But neither of them knew that yet. At that moment, it was just a young couple saying goodbye, hoping they would see each other again. When Khe arrived in Vietnam, he didn't take the easy road. There were plenty of assignments that would have kept him relatively safe. Jobs in the rear areas, staff positions, logistical roles. But Khe didn't want that. He volunteered for Recon Battalion. Now, I need to explain what that means, because Marine Recon units were not your standard infantry. These were small, specialized teams, usually just a handful of men, whose job was to go deep into enemy territory, gather intelligence, and get out without being detected. The whole point of a recon patrol was to see without being seen. If you were spotted, if you made contact with the enemy, you had already messed up. Your mission was to observe, to report, to call in artillery or airstrikes on enemy positions you identified, but to avoid a firefight at all costs. Because if a 6 or 8 or 12-man recon team got into a sustained engagement with a larger enemy force, the math was not in their favor. These guys operated in some of the most dangerous conditions you can imagine, way out in the bush, far from support, with nothing but their training, their weapons, and each other to rely on. The training to become a recon Marine was grueling. These men had to be experts at land navigation, which meant being able to find their way through unfamiliar terrain using just a map and compass, often in the dark. They had to be proficient with multiple weapon systems, not just their own rifles, but machine guns, shotguns, grenade launchers, whatever they might need. They had to be trained in first aid, because if someone got hurt out in the bush, there was no medic coming to save them. They had to handle it themselves. They had to learn the art of camouflage and concealment, how to move through the jungle without leaving a trace, how to set up a position that would be invisible from 10 feet away. They had to be in peak physical condition, capable of humping 60 or 70 pounds of gear through dense jungle and steep terrain for days at a time, on minimal sleep and often inadequate food. And they had to be mentally tough, able to handle the stress and isolation and constant danger without cracking. Klebe later told his father that running recon patrols in Vietnam was a lot like hunting back home in South Carolina. You had to be quiet, you had to be patient, you had to read the terrain and understand your quarry. You had to think like the thing you were hunting, anticipate its movements, figure out where it would go and when. The difference, of course, was that in Vietnam, the quarry could shoot back, and the quarry was smart, experienced, and highly motivated. The North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong had been fighting one war or another for decades, first against the Japanese, then against the French, now against the Americans. They knew the terrain intimately. They had the support of much of the local population, and they were fighting for their homeland. Underestimating them was a fatal mistake that too many Americans made. Klebe led one of these small recon teams, and the men under his command became his brothers. In that kind of situation, where your life depends on the man next to you and his life depends on you, bonds form that are hard to describe to anyone who hasn't experienced it. You learn each other's habits, each other's strengths and weaknesses, each other's tells. You know how a guy moves when he's tired, how he holds his rifle when he's nervous, what look he gets in his eye when something doesn't feel right. You communicate with hand signals and glances, sometimes going for hours without speaking a word. You sleep in shifts, one man always awake, always watching. You eat cold rations because a cooking fire would give away your position. You relieve yourself in bags that you carry out with you, because leaving any sign of your presence could be the thing that gets you killed. It's an intimacy born of shared danger, and it creates relationships that last a lifetime. The point man, the guy who walks at the front of the patrol, had what was arguably the most dangerous job. He was the one most likely to trip a booby trap or walk into an ambush first. Every patrol needed a point man, and it was a job that required incredible alertness and no small amount of courage. You were the first one into danger, every single time. Your job was to find the threats before they found the rest of the patrol, and sometimes that meant finding them the hard way. And Vietnam was full of booby traps. The Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese were masters at turning the jungle itself into a weapon. I want to spend some time talking about this because it's an important part of understanding what the men who served there went through. The constant, grinding anxiety of knowing that death could be waiting with the next step you took. They'd dig pits and line them with sharpened bamboo stakes called punji sticks, sometimes smeared with human waste or poison to cause infection. These pits could be covered with leaves or grass to make them invisible, and a man would step on what looked like solid ground and suddenly find himself falling onto a forest of sharpened stakes. The wounds were horrific, and the infections that followed could be deadly, even if the initial injury wasn't. Some of these pits were designed with stakes pointing downward at angles, so that once your leg went in, pulling it out would cause even more damage. Others were dug in pairs, so that when a man fell into one pit and his buddy rushed to help him, the buddy would fall into the second pit. They'd rig grenades to tripwires stretched across trails so that the first man to walk through would pull the pin and blow himself and everyone around him to pieces. They'd set up whip traps where a bent piece of bamboo loaded with spikes would snap back into your chest or legs if you triggered it. They used mace traps, enormous weighted balls covered in spikes that would swing down from the trees with enough force to kill a man instantly. They used what they called tiger traps, heavy weighted boards covered in downward-pointing spikes that would drop from above onto anyone who tripped the wire. And those were just the manually constructed booby traps. They also used unexploded ordnance, American bombs and artillery shells that hadn't detonated, which they would dig up and rig to blow when disturbed. According to some reports, 90% of the booby-trapped mines that wounded or killed American soldiers were actually mines that had originally been laid by American or South Vietnamese forces and then recovered and reused by the enemy. They used cartridge traps, which were basically pits with a single bullet pointing upward, positioned over a nail. When a soldier stepped on the bullet, his own weight would drive it down onto the nail, which would function as a firing pin, and the round would fire straight up through his foot. Every step you took in the bush could be your last, and the men of recon knew that better than anyone. The psychological toll of this was immense. Soldiers developed a kind of hypervigilance that stayed with them long after they came home. They learned to scan every inch of ground before they stepped on it, to look for disturbed dirt or broken twigs or any tiny sign that something was wrong. They learned to distrust everything, to assume that any object they encountered might be designed to kill them. A discarded pack, a flag lying on the ground, a piece of military equipment that looked valuable. All of these could be rigged with explosives. The enemy knew that American soldiers would be tempted to pick up souvenirs or examine interesting objects, and they used that knowledge against them. According to some reports, something like 11% of Army deaths and 17% of wounds during the war came from booby traps and mines. That's a huge percentage, and it speaks to how effective these simple, low-tech weapons were against the most advanced military in the world. Klebe also talked about the wildlife over there, which might seem like a strange thing to focus on in a war zone, but it was part of the environment these men lived in every day. He said the birds were beautiful. All kinds of species he'd never seen before, with bright colors and strange calls. Vietnam is home to hundreds of bird species, many of them found nowhere else on Earth. And even in the middle of a war, there was something striking about seeing a flash of brilliant feathers in the jungle canopy. The monkeys, on the other hand, were annoying. They'd make noise at the worst possible times and give away your position. A recon team depends on stealth, and having a troop of monkeys screeching overhead was the last thing you wanted when you were trying to move silently through enemy territory. And the water buffalo, well, they did not like Marines. These enormous animals were used throughout Vietnam as beasts of burden, pulling plows and carts, but they could be dangerous if provoked. And for some reason, they seemed to have a particular antipathy toward American servicemen. Maybe it was the smell, or the unfamiliar uniforms. But water buffalo charged at Marines often enough that it became a running joke. A dangerous joke, but a joke nonetheless. Klebe didn't see a lot of snakes, which was probably a blessing, because the jungles of Vietnam were home to some of the most venomous snakes in the world. The bamboo pit viper was common, a bright green snake that could blend in perfectly with the vegetation and deliver a bite that would cause your flesh to swell and necrotize within minutes. The Malayan crate, which the soldiers called the two-step snake, because supposedly that's how far you'd get after being bitten before you dropped dead. Whether that's exactly true or not, it gives you an idea of how dangerous these creatures were. The venom of a crate attacks the nervous system, paralyzing the muscles that let you breathe. And without immediate medical treatment, death would follow quickly. And the Viet Cong actually used them as weapons sometimes, putting them in their packs so that anyone who searched them would get bitten, or tying them up in the tunnel complexes they dug all over the country. The tunnels of Khe Sanh and other areas were an entire underground world, miles of passageways where the enemy could live, store supplies, plan operations, and emerge to strike before disappearing again. American soldiers who went into those tunnels, the so-called tunnel rats, had to deal not only with enemy soldiers and booby traps, but with snakes, scorpions, spiders, and all manner of other dangerous creatures that had taken up residence in the dark. Klebe had sympathy for the Vietnamese civilians caught in the middle of this war. He understood that many of them were forced to fight, either for the communists or alongside the South Vietnamese government, whether they wanted to or not. Their villages were caught between two sides of a conflict that had been going on in one form or another for decades. First against the Japanese occupation during World War II, then against the French colonial rule in the First Indochina War, and now against the Americans and their allies in what had become the Vietnam War. If they helped one side, the other side might kill them. The Viet Cong would come into a village and demand food, supplies, recruits. If the villagers refused, they or their families might be killed. If they complied, the Americans or South Vietnamese might treat them as enemy collaborators and do the same. It was an impossible situation for ordinary people just trying to survive, trying to grow their rice and raise their children and live their lives. The human cost of that war, for the Vietnamese people as well as for the Americans, is almost impossible to calculate. As for the enemy fighters themselves, Klebe's view was pretty straightforward. They could not be trusted. The truces that were declared from time to time, the Christmas truces and the Tet truces, and the various ceasefires that were announced, were a joke in his view. The enemy would use them to resupply and reposition, moving men and equipment into place while the Americans stood down, and then the fighting would start all over again the moment the truce period ended. This was a source of tremendous frustration for the men who were doing the fighting. They felt that the rules of engagement hampered their ability to win, that political considerations back in Washington prevented them from taking the fight to the enemy in the way that would have been most effective. Whether that assessment is fair or accurate is something historians still debate, but it reflects the feelings of many who served. Life on recon patrol was hard and dangerous, and Klebe and his men had some close calls before that final night. Once, they got caught in a crossfire between the enemy on one side and their own forces on the other. That's a nightmare scenario. Bullets coming from every direction, and some of them from guys who were supposed to be on your side. Friendly fire incidents were tragically common in Vietnam, as they are in all wars, and the chaos of combat makes it inevitable that sometimes you'll be shooting at people who are shooting at the same enemy you are. Another time, Klebe got separated from his men for 3 days. 3 days alone in enemy territory in Vietnam. I can't even imagine what that must have been like. Not knowing where your team is, not knowing if they're still alive, not knowing if anyone is coming for you. Moving through the jungle alone, trying to find your way back to friendly lines, avoiding enemy patrols, surviving on whatever you could find. But he made it. He survived, and he kept leading his men on patrol after patrol. Among the men under Klebe's command were some individuals who would play crucial roles in the story that was about to unfold. There was Oscar Munoz, his radio man, a Mexican-American Marine who kept the communication lines open. The radio man in a recon patrol is crucial because he's the one who maintains contact with the rear, who calls in artillery and air support, who requests extraction when the mission is done or when things go bad. Oscar was good at his job, and he and Klebe developed a close working relationship. There was a young man named Ralph Johnson, a private first class from Charleston, South Carolina. Ralph was just 19 years old, an athlete, a kid really, who had enlisted in the Marine Corps in March of 1967 and arrived in Vietnam in January of 1968. He'd only been in country for a couple of months. He was dedicated, and he was brave, and he had volunteered for this mission even though he didn't have to. Klebe later said that Ralph was like a son to him, which tells you something about the depth of feeling that developed between these men. Despite the age gap, despite the difference in rank, they had formed a bond that went beyond the professional relationship between an officer and his enlisted man. And there were others, men whose names are known to their families and to history, who would all be tested on the night of March 5, 1968. The mission was part of something called Operation Rock, which was a 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines sweep through an area northwest of An Hoa Combat Base. An Hoa was one of the major Marine installations in the region, located in Quang Nam Province, west of Hoi An. It served as a launching point for operations into the surrounding area, an area that was hotly contested and thoroughly dangerous. The region the Marines were operating in was known to them as the Arizona Territory, and it was bad country, heavily controlled by the North Vietnamese Army, what the soldiers called the NVA. This wasn't a place where you'd encounter a few guerrillas with old rifles. This was a place where regular NVA units operated in battalion and regimental strength, well-equipped, well-trained, and well-led. The Quan Duc Valley was particularly dangerous, a valley deep in enemy-controlled territory where the NVA could move and mass with relative impunity. And that's exactly where Klebe's team was sent. Their job was to set up an observation post on Hill 146, a piece of high ground overlooking the valley, and to gather intelligence on enemy movements and positions. This was classic recon work, finding the enemy so that others could destroy him. A few days before the main operation was supposed to kick off, helicopters dropped Klebe's 15-man reconnaissance patrol on top of the hill. 15 men, alone on a hilltop in the middle of enemy territory, with nothing but their weapons and their training and each other. And at first, things went well. Really well, actually. Over the first 2 days, Klebe's team was incredibly successful, calling in 12 fire missions against enemy targets they'd spotted from their position. That's a lot of enemy positions getting hit with artillery because of what they were reporting. 12 fire missions in 2 days. They were doing exactly what they were supposed to do, finding the enemy and bringing destruction down on his head. But here's the thing about being that successful. When you're calling in that much fire, the enemy notices. They start looking for you. They know that somewhere out there is a small team of Americans who can see their positions and direct artillery onto them, and they will do anything to find and eliminate that threat. The NVA wasn't stupid. They had been fighting wars for decades, and they knew how recon teams operated. They knew that a patrol calling in that many fire missions had to be on high ground somewhere, had to be in a position where they could observe. And in the Quan Duc Valley, they found them. There's some uncertainty in the historical record about exactly what happened to the larger operation that Klebe's patrol was supposed to be supporting. What Klebe later recounted was that the mission was ultimately canceled, or at least changed, and his team ended up stranded on that hilltop, surrounded by the enemy with no immediate way out. The larger force that was supposed to be sweeping through the area, the force that would have provided support if the recon team got into trouble, wasn't coming. They were alone on Hill 146, waiting for extraction that wasn't coming soon enough. And the NVA knew they were there. The enemy had found them, had figured out where the fire missions were being called from, and had moved forces into position to attack. The attack came just after midnight on March 5, 1968. Klebe thought he heard something at the bottom of the hill, some noise that didn't belong, something that broke the natural rhythm of the jungle sounds at night. A trained recon Marine learns to listen for those anomalies, to distinguish between the sounds that belong and the sounds that mean trouble. He left his position to go check on his men to the right. That's when all hell broke loose. A group of North Vietnamese soldiers, later estimated at platoon size or larger, charged up the hill, firing small arms and throwing grenades and satchel charges. A satchel charge is basically a bag of explosives that can be thrown or placed against a target, and when it goes off, it's devastating. The team was outnumbered something like 12-1. Klebe's men were in fighting holes they dug into the hillside, basically shallow pits that provided some cover from incoming fire, and some of those holes had been reinforced with punji sticks at the bottom as an additional defensive measure against enemy soldiers who might try to jump in with them. The NVA hit them with everything they had. Klebe was struck almost immediately. Grenade shrapnel ripped into his neck and shoulder, tearing flesh and spilling blood. But he didn't go down. He made it back to his position and got on the radio, calling for artillery support and air support, anything that could help them hold off the assault. He needed the big guns, needed the spookies, needed anything that could put firepower on the enemy swarming up that hill. Following up the initial attack, about a dozen NVA soldiers came charging straight at the Marine positions, with grenades and satchel charges in their hands, pins already pulled. These were suicide attackers, sappers, men who had already committed to dying as long as they could take some Marines with them. They knew that if they could get close enough, if they could get inside the defensive perimeter, the explosives they were carrying would cause carnage, regardless of what happened to them personally. One of them appeared right in front of Klebe. The enemy soldier was about to fire, but before he could get off a shot, Klebe hit him with a blast from his shotgun at point-blank range. Both men fell into a hole together. And then the satchel charge the enemy soldier was carrying exploded. The blast hurled both men through the air like rag dolls. When Klebe tried to reach back for his shotgun, to grab his weapon and keep fighting, he made a terrible discovery. His left arm was gone, blown off below the elbow by the explosion. He was still alive, somehow, but he was badly wounded, and the fight was just getting started. There was no time to process what had happened, no time to panic or grieve. The enemy was still coming, and his men needed him. A grenade landed in the fighting hole to Klebe's right, a hole occupied by Ralph Johnson and 2 other Marines. One of his men, a young Marine who saw what was about to happen, did something that defines the word hero. He threw himself on that grenade, smothered it with his own body. Ralph Henry Johnson, 19 years old, from Charleston, South Carolina. The explosion killed him instantly and fatally wounded another Marine nearby. But by absorbing the blast with his body, by taking the full force of that explosion into himself, he saved the lives of the other men in that hole. he kept the defensive perimeter intact. If that position had fallen, if the men in that hole had been killed or incapacitated, the NVA would have poured through the gap, and the whole patrol might have been wiped out. Ralph Johnson's sacrifice, in that split second of decision, changed everything. To Kleeb's left, his radio man Oscar Munoz and the corpsman were both down, unresponsive. To the rear, 5 more of his men were wounded. The position was falling apart around him. Kleeb tried to fight back, tried to pull the pin on a grenade to throw at the enemy, but he couldn't. His teeth had been shattered by grenade shrapnel, and he couldn't grip the pin with them. With one arm gone and his teeth broken, he couldn't arm a grenade. And then another grenade came in. This one hit him directly. It blew out his left eye. It ripped open his right hand, the only hand he had left. It burst both of his eardrums. He was blind in one eye, deaf in both ears, missing an arm, bleeding from wounds all over his body, and the enemy was still coming. Somehow, he was still conscious. He tried to make it to a bomb crater for cover, but another grenade caught him and shredded his legs, slamming him to the ground. And here's where Ralph Johnson's story reaches its terrible and heroic conclusion that I need to pause on for a moment, because what he did deserves to be understood and remembered. There was another fighting hole nearby, occupied by Ralph and 2 other Marines, and a grenade landed right in that hole with them. Ralph saw it. In the darkness, in the chaos, in the smoke and noise of the battle raging around them, he saw that grenade land among his friends. He shouted a warning, telling them to get back, giving them what fraction of a second he could. And then, without hesitation, he threw himself on top of that grenade. He covered it with his stomach, his body absorbing the full impact of the explosion. It killed him instantly. He was 19 years old. He had been in Vietnam for about 2 months, but by doing what he did, by sacrificing his own life without a moment's hesitation, he saved the lives of the 2 Marines in that hole with him. Kleeb McClary, lying on the ground with his arm gone, his eye gone, his eardrums burst, his legs shredded, his remaining hand torn open, tried to crawl toward Ralph, but he couldn't get there before another blast went off nearby. As all this was happening, an NVA soldier closed in on Kleeb, ready to finish him off with a shot to the head. This was going to be the end. But one of Kleeb's men, one of the Marines still able to fight, saw what was about to happen and shot the enemy soldier. The bullet hit the NVA soldier and deflected his aim, and saved Kleeb's life in the same moment it ended the enemy's. Throughout this entire ordeal, which felt like it went on forever, but probably lasted maybe an hour or so of the most intense fighting imaginable, Kleeb never lost consciousness. He kept shouting commands and encouragement to his men. He kept trying to lead them, even though his body was broken in ways that should have killed him. This is what leadership under fire looks like. Not giving up, even when everything in you says it's over. Not quitting on the men who depend on you, even when you have every excuse to lie there and wait to die. When he finally called for extraction, the situation was desperate. The helicopters were their only chance. A medevac bird, or any bird that could get them off that hill, was the difference between living and dying. The first helicopter came in to pick up the wounded, threading its way through enemy fire to set down on that hilltop long enough to load casualties. Then the second. The pilots and crews of those helicopters were heroes in their own right, flying into a hot landing zone where they could be shot down at any moment, holding their birds steady while wounded men were loaded aboard. And just as that second chopper lifted off with Kleeb and the remaining survivors aboard, The hill was overrun. About 150 North Vietnamese soldiers swarmed over the position, but there was no one left to kill. They had gotten out with literally minutes to spare, maybe less. Of Kleeb's patrol, 2 men were dead, and everyone else was wounded. Everyone. Not a single man came off that hill without blood on him, his own blood or someone else's. For his actions that night, Klebe and McClary would later receive the Silver Star, the 3rd highest decoration for valor in combat. Ralph Johnson would be awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration in the United States, posthumously. His citation reads that he displayed conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. But the story didn't end on that helicopter. For Klebe, it was just the beginning of a different kind of battle, a battle that would go on for years. The team was flown to a nearby hospital where Klebe and the other survivors were rushed into surgery. Klebe barely hung on to life. The doctors worked frantically to stabilize him, to stop the bleeding, to repair what damage could be repaired. His recovery would take more than 2 years. He underwent more than 30 major surgeries, some accounts say closer to 40, and countless hours of physical therapy. He had lost his left arm below the elbow. He had lost his left eye. His face was badly disfigured from the grenade shrapnel. His body was full of metal fragments. His right hand was mangled. His legs had been torn up. His eardrums were destroyed. Doctors weren't sure he was going to make it. There were times when giving up would have been the easy choice, when letting go would have been a relief from the pain and the despair. At one point, Klebe was lying in a hospital bed, his eyes temporarily sewn shut to protect them while they healed, bandages covering most of his body, unable to hear anything because his eardrums were gone. A chaplain came to visit the wounded, a Navy captain named Frank Casper, who would later become a general. As the story goes, a doctor tried to steer Casper away from Klebe's bed, telling him that guy's not going to make it. There's no point in talking to him. But Casper walked over anyway. He leaned in close and identified himself to the young Marine, who couldn't see and could barely hear. He told Klebe, "I love you, and I'm praying for you. Thank you for what you did. God's got a purpose for your life." For Klebe, it was like a wake-up call, like a slap in the face, but in a good way, because he needed to hear it. He later said that he believed God sent that chaplain to him at that moment, when he was at his lowest, when he was ready to give up, to remind him that his story wasn't over yet, that there was still a reason to keep fighting. The months and years that followed were incredibly hard. Anyone who has seen a badly wounded veteran go through rehabilitation knows what I'm talking about. The pain is constant, a background hum that never goes away and often spikes into agony. The frustration of trying to do simple things that you used to do without thinking. Buttoning a shirt, tying a shoe, feeding yourself, and finding that you can't. The depression that comes from looking in the mirror and not recognizing the person looking back. The wondering what your life is going to look like now that everything has changed. Whether anyone will want you. Whether you'll ever be able to work or have a family or do any of the things you dreamed about before the war. Klebe had to learn to do everything differently. He had to adapt to a body that was never going to be the same, that would never again be what it was before that night on Hill 146. His wife, Deanna, was with him through all of it. She had only been married to Klebe for 6 months when he shipped out to Vietnam. She was a young bride, barely more than a girl, and now she was spending years in VA hospitals helping her husband learn to live again. She later said that it took spending more than 2.5 years with Khe in a VA hospital as he recovered to understand how important it is not to take freedom for granted. She became his partner in recovery, his caregiver, his encourager, the person who believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. Their marriage would last, would endure through all the trials that followed, because it was built on something stronger than convenience or attraction. It was built on love and commitment and shared sacrifice. But Khe made a choice. He later put it this way when he spoke to groups of young people. Are you going to get bitter, or are you going to get better? I chose to get better, and you can too. That's the message he's been sharing ever since, the message that came out of all that suffering and loss. You can't control what happens to you. You can't always control the circumstances of your life, the cards you're dealt, the blows that land. But you can control how you respond. You can choose bitterness, resentment, despair, or you can choose to take whatever you've got left and make something of it. Khe chose the latter, and his life since Vietnam has been a testament to what's possible when you make that choice. Khe McClary came home from Vietnam on a stretcher, so he didn't see much of the anti-war sentiment that was being directed at returning veterans in that era. You've probably heard the stories about soldiers being spit on, being called baby killers, being treated with contempt by people who opposed the war and somehow blamed the men who had fought it, rather than the politicians who had sent them. Khe was spared most of that at first, because he was in hospitals for so long. He was isolated from the country that was tearing itself apart over the war, focused entirely on the immediate struggle to survive and recover. But later, after his recovery, he did encounter people who made it clear they didn't appreciate his service. He dealt with that the same way he dealt with everything else, by pressing forward and not letting it define him, by refusing to become the bitter, broken veteran that some people expected him to be. After he recovered, Khe found a new calling as a public speaker. He started traveling around the country, speaking to schools, churches, civic groups, military bases, anyone who would listen. He told his story, the story of Hill 146 and Ralph Johnson, and the lessons he'd learned about courage, faith, sacrifice, and perseverance. He became one of the most sought-after motivational speakers in the nation, a man whose message transcended politics and partisanship because it was rooted in something universal, the human capacity to endure and overcome. Over the decades, he's spoken in all 50 states and more than 50 countries. He's reached literally tens of thousands of people with his message, maybe hundreds of thousands when you count all the audiences over all those years. He once said that he figured he recruited more people for the military than any recruiter ever did, just by telling his story and inspiring young people to serve. But something about that bothered him too, and I think it's worth thinking about. He knew that some of those young people, inspired by his example, might end up in places like that hilltop in the Quang Duc Valley. They might end up giving everything, like Ralph Johnson did. They might come home broken, like Khe did. Or they might not come home at all. To inspire someone to serve is to potentially inspire them to sacrifice, and that's a heavy thing to carry. Khe never flinched from it, never stopped telling his story, but he understood the weight of what he was doing. Khe has also been outspoken about his views on how the Vietnam War was conducted. His position is that we could have won, and not just Vietnam, but other conflicts too, if the troops had been turned loose to do the job. He remembers being there and wondering why they kept taking the same hill over and over again, fighting and dying for ground that they'd then be ordered to abandon, only to have to fight for it all over again later. The political constraints on the military, the rules of engagement, the limitations placed on what they could and couldn't do, the gradual escalation instead of decisive action, all of that frustrated him and many others who served. Whether you agree with that assessment or not, it's a perspective that a lot of Vietnam veterans share. They felt that they were being asked to fight with one hand tied behind their back, that victory was achievable but was never really pursued, that the sacrifices they made were wasted by decisions made far away in Washington by people who had never fired a shot in anger. I want to say a little more about Ralph Johnson, because his sacrifice deserves to be remembered and honored in its own right, not just as part of Klebe's story, but as the story of a young man who gave everything. Ralph Henry Johnson was born on January 11, 1949, in Charleston, South Carolina. He was a kid from downtown, grew up off Highway 61 and on Cumming Street, went to Courtney Elementary School and C.A. Brown High School, a young African-American man coming of age in the South in the 1960s, a time of tremendous upheaval and change. He was an athlete, well-liked by his peers, a normal young man with his whole life ahead of him. He enlisted in the Marine Corps in March of 1967 and arrived in Vietnam in January of 1968. He was killed in March. He had been in country for about 2 months when he threw himself on that grenade. That's how fast it could happen over there. You could be a teenager one day, fresh off the plane, still learning the sounds and smells and rhythms of this strange and dangerous country, and 2 months later, you'd be dead on a hillside because you chose to save your friends instead of yourself. Ralph Johnson was African American, and Clede McClary was a white man from rural South Carolina. This was 1968, the same year that Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, shot down in Memphis just a few weeks after Ralph died in Vietnam. It was the same year that race riots tore through American cities after King's death, the same year that Robert Kennedy was killed, the same year that the country seemed to be coming apart at the seams. The country was deeply divided along racial lines, maybe as divided as it had been since the Civil War. In the South, where both men came from, the legacy of slavery and segregation and Jim Crow was still very much alive. The Civil Rights Act had only been passed a few years earlier. The wounds were fresh, and the tensions were high. But on Hill 146, none of that mattered. Klebe later said it plainly, and it's one of the most powerful things I've ever heard. He was a white lieutenant from rural South Carolina, and a black man from Charleston saved his life at the cost of his own. The blood is red, and the uniform's green, and the rest of it doesn't matter. That's a powerful statement, and it speaks to something that a lot of combat veterans understand from first-hand experience. In the crucible of war, the petty divisions that seem so important back home just fall away. When bullets are flying and grenades are exploding and everyone around you is trying to stay alive for just one more minute, you don't care about the color of the man next to you. You care about whether he's going to do his job, whether he's going to have your back, whether he'll be there when you need him. Ralph Johnson had Clebe McClary's back. He had everyone's back, and he paid for it with everything he had. The recognition Ralph Johnson has received over the years is well-deserved, though it came too late for him to see it. His Medal of Honor was presented to his family by Vice President Spiro Agnew at the White House in April of 1970, more than 2 years after his death. His mother and sister accepted the medal on his behalf, a small piece of metal and ribbon that represented the largest sacrifice a person can make. In 1991, The VA Medical Center in Charleston was renamed the Ralph H. Johnson Department of Veterans Affairs Medical Center, a place where veterans receive care in the name of a man who gave his life for his fellow Marines. And in March of 2018, 50 years after that night on Hill 146, the Navy commissioned a new guided missile destroyer named the USS Ralph Johnson. It's an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, one of the most advanced warships in the world, and it carries the name of a 19-year-old Marine who died in a fighting hole in the Quanduck Valley. At the commissioning ceremony, Cleve McClary was there. He was one of the speakers, one of the survivors of that patrol who had lived to tell the tale because of what Ralph did. He said that Ralph would have been embarrassed by all the attention, all the ceremony. He would have been shy, he would have smiled, but he would have been proud of his city, proud that Charleston remembered him. Cleve said he missed him. After all those years, more than half a century, he still missed him. That's what it means to have someone save your life. You carry them with you forever. Looking back at Cleve McClary's life, you see a man who could have let what happened to him define him in a negative way. He could have become bitter, could have given up, could have spent his years feeling sorry for himself and blaming the world for what he'd lost. And honestly, nobody would have blamed him if he had. He gave more than most people are ever asked to give, and he suffered more than most people will ever suffer. But instead, he chose to use what happened to him as a way to help others. He chose to turn his pain into a message of hope and perseverance and faith. He found his purpose, just like that chaplain told him he would all those years ago in that hospital room. I think there's a lesson in that for all of us, whether we've been through anything like what Cleve went through or not. Life is going to knock you down. Bad things are going to happen that you didn't deserve and couldn't prevent. The question is what you do next. Do you stay down? Do you give up? Do you let the bitterness poison everything that comes after? Or do you find a way to get back up and keep moving forward? To take whatever you've got left and make something meaningful out of it? Cleve McClary got back up. Ralph Johnson gave his life so that others could have a chance to get back up. That's the kind of sacrifice that makes this country what it is, the kind of courage that deserves to be remembered and honored. I want to mention one more thing before we finish up today. The AC-47 Spooky gunship, which I mentioned earlier as part of the Vietnam experience, was one of those innovations that came out of necessity and ended up changing the way wars are fought. The idea was simple. Take an old cargo plane and turn it into a flying gun platform that could circle over a battlefield for hours, providing sustained fire support to troops on the ground. The Spooky could put a bullet into every square foot of an area the size of a football field in about 10 seconds. When a patrol or outpost was under attack at night, the arrival of a Spooky overhead was often the difference between life and death. The flares it dropped turned night into day, exposing the enemy to fire. The miniguns it carried could cut down attackers like a scythe through wheat. Combat reports indicate that no village or hamlet that was under Spooky protection was ever lost to enemy attack. That's a remarkable record, and it speaks to the bravery of the crews who flew those missions, who circled in their slow, vulnerable aircraft over firefights and kept fighting until the job was done or the ammunition ran out. As I wrap up here, I want to just take a moment to reflect on what we've talked about today. Cleve McClary is still alive, as of the last reports I've seen. He's in his 80s now, living in Pawleys Island, South Carolina, not far from where he grew up. He's spent decades spreading his message of faith and resilience and service. Ralph Johnson has been dead for over 50 years, but his legacy lives on in the ship that bears his name, the medical center that serves veterans in his hometown, the scholarship fund established at the Citadel, and the memories of the men whose lives he saved. The other members of that patrol, those who survived that night, have carried their experiences with them through all the years since. Some of them have reunited over the decades, coming together to remember what they went through and to honor the friends they lost. For men like that, March will always be a hard month, the anniversary of the night that changed everything. Vietnam was a complicated, controversial war, and people still argue about whether we should have been there and how it was handled and what it all meant. I'm not going to try to settle those debates here, and honestly, I don't think they can be settled. But what I will say is that the men who served, who went over there because their country called them and did what was asked of them, they deserve our respect and our gratitude, regardless of how we feel about the policies that sent them. They didn't make the decisions at the top. They didn't choose to fight in Vietnam. They just did their jobs, often in conditions that were horrific beyond anything most of us can imagine. And some of them, like Ralph Johnson, gave everything they had. Others, like Clede McClary, gave almost everything, and then spent the rest of their lives turning that sacrifice into something meaningful. So before we go, I just want to say thank you for listening to this story today. These are the kinds of accounts that I think need to be told and remembered, not because war is something to celebrate, but because the people who serve in wars, who sacrifice and suffer and sometimes die, they matter. Their stories matter. The courage they showed, and the bonds they formed, and the choices they made under impossible circumstances, all of that is part of our history as Americans, part of what defines us as a nation. Clede McClary chose to get better instead of getting bitter. Ralph Johnson chose to give his life for his friends. Those are choices that say something about who we can be at our best, even in the worst of times. The blood is red, and the uniform is green, and the rest doesn't matter. I hope that Clede's message continues to reach people for many years to come, and I hope that Ralph Johnson is never forgotten. They earned that much, and so much more. Thanks for joining me today on Great American Classics. Until next time, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and remember the ones who gave so much so that we could be here today. God bless our veterans, and God bless America.